Now, again, to play devil's advocate,
they end up getting, like a confirmation bias, if you will. Do you ever think about that with respect to your faith?
According to the Sinai Bible, Jesus wasn't crucified in that Bible.
Like, what do you think about ancient hominids, Australopithecus, Neanderthals?
And to be clear, like the Da Vinci Code.
So some corrective history there, but I don't know anybody in the field of papyrology, paleography, historiography, who actually refers to these documents as being legitimate.
Eyewitness testimony notoriously is unreliable. It's the least credible evidence in a courtroom.
I would take a very early dating of the vast majority of the New Testament.
So what is your personal belief when it comes to the resurrection? This is a highly unusual activity.
Highly unusual.
Right.
And what if you don't feel like you're a piece of shit?
Right.
So now I have to stop feeling good about myself, and I have to convince myself that I am a piece of shit.
In one sense, you're more of a piece of shit than you can imagine. If it's only you're a piece of shit, that's a problem.
Wes Huff has skyrocketed to fame after his infamous debate with Billy Carson that went absolutely viral. Since then, Wes has been invited to interview with some of the largest podcasters and media personalities in the world, such as Joe Rogan, Piers Morgan, Patrick Bet-David, and more. I collected Wes's most epic answers to the many challenges against his faith, progressing to what I think is his most epic answer at the end. Piers Morgan is an English journalist and media personality, and in his interview with Wes, Piers rapidly asks a series of great questions, and Wes gives some terrific answers. Watch Piers ask if Jesus actually existed.
Is it indisputable to you that Jesus Christ existed, for example?
Oh, definitely so. I think we can say pretty unequivocally that a character, a first century Jewish itinerant rabbi by the name of Jesus of Nazareth, did walk the dusty streets of first century Roman occupied Judea. I think that even the most skeptical scholars will grant that if we know very little about Jesus, we know that he did exist and that he was crucified in and around the beginning of the first century under the overseeing of the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate.
Even famous Bible skeptic Bart Ehrman admits Jesus' existence. Bart has written, "The reality is that every single author who mentions Jesus, pagan, Christian, or Jewish, was fully convinced that he at least lived. And we have more evidence for Jesus than we have for almost anyone else from his time period." Joe Rogan's interview with Wes is the single most watched Christian interview in the history of the world. Here, Joe asks about the oldest versions of the Bible, and Wes explains one of the greatest archaeological discoveries ever made.
What is the oldest version of the Bible, or the stories in the Bible? Is it the Dead Sea Scrolls, or are there older versions?
The Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest of the Old Testament. So when they were discovered, so they were discovered in 1946 to 1957. And at that point, during their discovery, they pushed back a lot of our previous oldest manuscripts 1,000 years. When we're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, like you have ones like the Great Isaiah Scroll, which is fully complete. Like it's a copy of the book of Isaiah, and it's a full complete scroll.
What's really fascinating is that the Dead Sea Scrolls include not just biblical books, but also ancient community rules, hymns, and prophecies. They give us an incredible snapshot of what Jewish life and beliefs looked like around the time of Jesus. And because some scrolls date to just a few hundred years before Christ, they help bridge the gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament world. Patrick Bet-David is an Iranian-American businessman, podcaster, and the founder and CEO of Valuetainment Investments Group and PHP Agency. Patrick's interview with Wes covers a lot of fascinating topics. Here's Patrick asking Wes about why so many people believe Billy Carson's blatant lies about the Bible.
Now, let me ask you, in 14 years since he's been creating content, or he's been out there, Billy, and, he's been sharing his stories that he has, why do you think this hasn't happened for 14 years?
I think you can strategically put yourself in positions where you're not going to be put on the defense. The thing is with the internet, and I'm sure you know this as well as anybody, Patrick, that like people love sensationalism. And we live in a world where we know a little about a lot, but we don't know a lot about a little. And so we live in this Wikipedia world, right? You can just hop online. You don't really need to know information. You can kind of, you can shed that out to someone else, right? You can, and the someone else being basically the supercomputer in your pocket. And people love sensationalism. People like to hear the crazy story, the conspiracy theory. For, sometimes I think genuine reasons. Some conspiracy theories are true sometimes. But I think when you have people who are saying pretty outrageous things, people like to be entertained, and people like the more sensationalistic theory than the mundane one.
This is actually why wild theories like the moon landing was faked, the earth is flat, or ancient aliens built the pyramids still have huge followings. They're more exciting than boring, evidence-based reality. Billy Carson taps into that same appetite for mystery and spectacle, even if it means completely rewriting history. When truth becomes optional and entertainment is king, whoever tells the flashiest story often wins. Julian Dorey worked on Wall Street in private banking for 4 to 5 years, and then went all in on becoming a successful podcaster. Julian's interview with Wes was fascinating, with Julian having some pretty strong opinions, and Wes correcting some of Julian's misconceptions. Here's Julian asking Wes about being biased.
I always ask them if their belief system, because that is a belief system too, ever they feel like it drives the results they end up getting, like a confirmation bias, if you will. Do you ever think about that with respect to your faith? Because that's obviously something very personal to you as well.
Yeah, I mean, we all have biases.
Yes.
I mean, find me the person who's neutral and you're not dealing with a real individual, right?
Possible.
So I'm totally fine with the biases that I hold. I mean, my field in biblical studies, there are a lot of secular scholars, and they also come in with a bias. And so it's not that it's like religious scholars versus secular scholars. I mean, we agree on a whole host of things, but often it's not the evidence and the rationale that we're disagreeing on, it's the conclusions that we then draw from it.
Right.
Christians aren't the only one with biases. Atheists, agnostics, Muslims, and scholars of all backgrounds bring their own assumptions to the table. So the real question isn't who is biased, but actually which bias best accounts for the full range of historical data. Here's famous atheist Alex O'Connor attacking what Wes said about the Isaiah scroll, and then Wes's response to Alex.
But one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that would be amazing if it were true.
Was my hyperbolic statement to Rogan a dishonest attempt to pull the wool over Rogan and his audience's eyes? No. Was I participating in disingenuous and underhanded apologetic tactics to try and gain points at the expense of truth? No. Should I have been more careful in my statement on Rogan about the Great Isaiah Scroll and used much more precise language, something to the effect of nearly identical rather than word for word identical, in order to not bring unnecessary and unfortunate scrutiny upon my discussion with him? Yes, but I hope you can see why I said what I said, and forgive me for my lack of precision. Discussing the intricacies of textual criticism to a general audience is not always easy, and in the course of a 3-hour podcast, conversational style, pulled off the top of my head on this big platform, I was not nearly as accurate as I should or could have been in this instance.
The Great Isaiah Scroll from Qumran is about 95% identical to the later Masoretic text, with the remaining differences mostly involving spelling, grammar, or stylistic variants, none affecting doctrine. This level of preservation over 1,000 years is unmatched in ancient literature and stunned scholars when it was first analyzed. It's one of the strongest pieces of evidence for the reliability of the Old Testament transmission across centuries. Here's Billy Carson challenging Wes about the quote-unquote Sinai Bible, and then immediately regretting it.
The statement is according to the Sinai Bible. Okay, according to the Sinai Bible, Jesus wasn't crucified in that Bible. And that Bible predates the King James Version of the Bible. And the text there actually is about 12 to 14,000 differences between the Sinai Bible and the King James Version of the Bible, which came much later.
Do you mind if I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
When you say the Sinai Bible, what are you referring to specifically?
It's the biblical text that was written. It made it into you can actually look it up on Amazon. It's a Bible called, I have a version at home. It's called the Sinai Bible, right, from Mount Sinai. I'm assuming that's the mountain that they're referencing there. But they put together their own version of the biblical text prior to the King James Version being put out.
Sure. So when you refer to the Sinai Bible, would you be referring to Codex Sinaiticus, like the codex that comes? Okay. That's why I was trying to get some clarification, because so you can actually go and see Codex Sinaiticus is at the British Library. So you can go and see it. It's on display. And the British Library has actually digitized the entire manuscript. So I work with manuscripts in my linguistic work. I'm an expert on early Christian scribal culture, and particularly in Greek and Coptic manuscripts. I actually have a facsimile. So I have a photocopy that was done by the British Library of Codex Sinaiticus that I work with in my office. So I have it here. And the only reason I asked for clarification is because I want to make sure that what I'm addressing is actually what you mean.
Gotcha.
And not addressing something else. Because the Codex Sinaiticus in particular is just it's a 4th century Greek manuscript. Mm-hmm. It comes from approximately between 325 and 350 AD. And its text of the Gospels reads almost identical to the modern Greek text that we develop translations from. So my curiosity is just simply in kind of exploring when you say that it denies the crucifixion or that the crucifixion isn't there. I mean, I can go on right now, Codex Sinaiticus, and I can look up the end of, say, Matthew 27, where it has Jesus being crucified. And that's in Codex Sinaiticus, or, the John 19, or any of the other ones. So I think my confusion is that it doesn't read any differently. So actually, are you able to pull up a website with the viewers or listeners or whatever be able to see that?
Right now to make sure I have the version that I'm looking at.
Codex Sinaiticus absolutely includes the crucifixion. Anyone can verify this online in digital facsimiles from the British Library. Claims of 12,000 to 14,000 differences are misleading. Most are minor spelling variants, or word order changes, not doctrinal shifts. In fact, Codex Sinaiticus actually confirms that core Christian doctrines like Jesus' death and resurrection were firmly in place by the 4th century. Piers Morgan presses Wes for hard historical evidence of the resurrection, and Wes gives him the evidence.
From the text of the New Testament, then, where is the actual hard evidence for you as an historian that actually happened?
Yeah, I think we do, Piers, have a historical question in terms of we have an actual character who we can demonstrate that lived, and then we have that same character being demonstrated in multiple independent and cross-reference sources, chief of which we call the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But just because those are religious texts now doesn't necessarily negate that they are historical texts. These were independent written sources that come from the time frame. If Paul says up to 500 witnesses who took part in this event before his ultimate, resurrecting, going to the ascension of the right hand of the Father. And so it's a historical question, Piers, in the sense that we have to account for what is the best inference to the explanation of this particular thing happening. And I would contend that given the historical data that we can look at, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility to explain this from a historical perspective, and that when we do so and we look at the independent testimonies that all intersect on this particular event, we actually, the best explanation to that is that this event actually did take place.
There are the 4 gospel accounts. Paul says there were 500 witnesses. There's the empty tomb reported by multiple sources. And there's the radical life changes of the apostles. The best explanation really does seem to be that Jesus' resurrection actually happened. Watch Joe Rogan react with amazement to Wes sharing about the discovery that the Dead Sea Scrolls copy of Isaiah is virtually identical to the version found 1,000 years later.
So when you say the book of Isaiah is intact, how similar is it to the book of Isaiah that's in the Bible?
So that one is fascinating. But when we discovered the Great Isaiah Scroll, previous to that, the earliest copy of Isaiah that we had was in the Masoretic text, which is in the Middle Ages.
Whoa.
Yeah, so it was literally 1,000 years. We literally pushed back our understanding of Isaiah 1,000 years. And the thing that really shocked scholars, but one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
This absolutely crushed the claim that the Bible had been distorted or rewritten over time. It showed that for over 1,000 years, scribes had been copying scripture with a level of precision that's honestly mind-blowing even by today's standards.
I had that Wesley Huff guy on, and one of the most fascinating things that I can't stop thinking about is how the book of Isaiah from the Dead Sea Scrolls was verbatim the same as the book of Isaiah that they found 1,000 years later.
Wow.
1,000 years.
Wow.
And it was exact, word for word.
Yeah.
Like, that's incredible.
Patrick Bet David asks Wes about how we know which gospels are real and which are fake. And Wes's answer demonstrates his expertise in this area of study.
Let's go through one of them. Let's start with the first one, Rob, if you want to go to that. So the Gospel of the Holy 12.
Yeah. So there you go. So the Gospel of the Holy 12, first serialized in the Lindsay and Lincolnshire Star newspaper between July 30th, 1898 and March 10th, 1901, presents vegetarian versions of traditional teachings and events described in the canonical New Testament. So this isn't something that has historical provenance. So it's not something that has kind of a paper trail going back into the ancient world. There are ancient apocryphal documents that you could capitalize on. Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter, but this is not one of them. So to choose this as your document to prove something, I'm just not entirely sure why you would go about that particular route. Or the other one is the Gospel of Barnabas, which is the one that Billy brought up with me, which is a clear middle-age forgery. It's not, and that's not a contested fact. It paraphrases Dante's Inferno. It has glaring historical inaccuracies.
And what's crazy is that even secular historians agree. These documents are obvious fakes. The quote-unquote Gospel of Barnabas describes medieval castles and feudal customs that didn't even exist in the first century. It's like claiming you found a diary of Julius Caesar, and he's talking about riding motorcycles. The timeline just doesn't fit. In the course of answering Julian's question about Jesus' resurrection, Wes said something very interesting about the Quran, which seems to be historically inaccurate about the death and crucifixion of Jesus.
And that's why, so when I was investigating Islam, one of the main problems that I had was this historical problem, where in chapter 4, verse 157 of the Quran, it says that Jesus was neither was he killed nor was he crucified, but it was made to appear to them. And then it says actually that those who believe it are not totally sure about this fact, which is...
Why does it say that?
Your guess is as good as mine. In fact, the problem with that particular surah, that particular chapter of the Quran, is that in the Islamic sources, you have a lot of commentary. So you have other Islamic literature. You have the Quran, which is the holy book. Then you have the hadith and the tafsir. And included in that group of literature are authoritative commentaries. But there is no authoritative commentary on this particular passage. And so there's a lot of different theories dependent on how you interpret that it was made to appear to them. So this is part of what we're talking about at Dunkin' Donuts. And for me, I mean, even if you go to the most skeptical iteration of historical biblical scholarship, if they can say basically, we can know very little, if anything, about Jesus, they'll say, we do know that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. And we know that because not only do we have these 4 biographies that we call the Gospels, we have Paul and then Jude and James all testifying to it. And then you have other sources like the Jewish Romano historian Josephus.
The crucifixion of Jesus is one of the most historically secure facts in ancient history, attested not just by Christian sources, but by non-Christian writers like Tacitus and Josephus. Even skeptical scholars like Bart Ehrman affirm it as virtually indisputable. The Quran's denial of this pretty much stands alone in world literature, and its ambiguity has led to centuries of conflicting Islamic interpretations. After Wes completely debunked Billy's comically bogus claims about the quote-unquote Sinai Bible, Billy attempts to say that he actually meant to say the Gospel of Barnabas, not the Sinai Bible. But even if Billy were being honest, which he was not, Wes also completely debunks this claim also. And then Billy just tries to change the subject, after getting embarrassed by Wes.
I found the text where I was referencing, actually, I was misquoted. I misquoted there. It's the Gospel of Barnabas.
Okay, yeah, well, so that's good. So let's deal with that too, because I've actually worked with, there are 2 manuscripts of the Gospel of Barnabas. The Gospel of Barnabas is a really interesting document because it is a known forgery. But the Gospel of Barnabas in particular, we know it's a forgery because it does things like in chapter 92, it says that Jesus spent 40 days on Mount Sinai, and then he came to the Jordan River and he walked to Jerusalem. But Mount Sinai is more than a week's journey away from Jerusalem, and neither Mount Sinai nor Jerusalem are close to the Jordan River. So never mind there not being a route from the Jordan River to like around Mount Sinai or going to Jerusalem. But there are internal problems with the Gospel of Barnabas, which indicate that it shows no actual indication of evidence of coming from or even having knowledge of first century Jewish understanding. It actually says Jesus is the Christ, but not the Messiah, which indicates that whoever the author is, he didn't know that those were the same words. And I think a bigger problem is that the Gospel of Barnabas actually paraphrases Dante's Inferno, which was written in 1314. So there's a lot of internal evidences that disqualify the Gospel of Barnabas, never mind the fact that we don't have any evidence of it prior to the 14th century, and none in any other language other than Middle Age Italian Italian and Spanish. But the internal content of the Gospel of Barnabas disqualifies it from being ancient. And then the fact that it's doing things like paraphrasing Dante, or it also refers to a rule of the time of Jubilee, which was changed in the Middle Ages from what it was in the biblical year of Jubilee. And it goes with the Middle Ages concept, not the ancient concept. So I think what I'm getting at is, so I'm a historian, and I deal with sources. So when I'm looking at sources, I want to make sure that I have a methodology by which I approach any type of source. So if there is something that denies the crucifixion, I want to make sure that I'm analyzing it and that the methodology by which I analyze it actually reveals that the content can be accurately tied to the event. So the only hesitation I have with what you said, Billy, is that we have single copies of the Gospels that can be dated to the 2nd century that all do have the crucifixion. And so if we're relying on something like the Gospel of Barnabas, which is not just like, it's not that there's debate about it, it's that it's a known forgery. I mean, no one's referring to the Gospel of Barnabas as anything other than...
If you say it's a known forgery and you're expert, I'm going to go with that. Let's talk about the Old Testament a little bit.
The Gospel of Barnabas also describes medieval-style church architecture and uses terms like shilling, which didn't exist in 1st century Judea. Some versions even include detailed Islamic theology that only developed centuries after Jesus, pointing to a likely origin in the post-Islamic era. Piers Morgan challenges the credibility of ancient eyewitnesses, and West gives some good reasons why we can actually trust them.
Now, again, to play devil's advocate, the argument against it goes, look, all these witnesses were likely to have been pretty primitive, mostly illiterate people. Eyewitness testimony notoriously is unreliable. It's the least credible evidence in a courtroom these days, for example.
Well, all of ancient history in one sense is hearsay, but that doesn't apply when we apply it to the historiographical method. We need to use the same standards that when we would look at something like, say, the biographies of Tiberius with Velleius Paterculus, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassiodeo. When we have multiple instances of reporting on someone's life, we look at both the things that they agree on and the things maybe where they have a differentiation in detail, and then we try to the best of our ability explain some of the different instances that are going on. Now, I would say, to the accusation, well, these are just ancient, illiterate people. That's what C.S. Lewis referred to as chronological snobbery. Just because people are ancient neither means they're stupid nor that they don't know what's going on. And what we have in terms of this event is really early on after Jesus's death, we have an explanation of what if the resurrection didn't take place, what we would expect. The 11 disciples are hiding in the upper room. They're scared. They're aware of other messianic movements in the ancient world. Individuals like Simon Bar Giora, who claimed to be the Messiah when his movement was squashed. So when he died, his movement was squashed. And so I think we have to look at okay, what explains these 11 scared disciples then going on to not just proclaim that Jesus did rise from the dead, but actually went to the point of risking their lives in persecution. And some of them did die for that proclamation. And so I think it's not outside of the realm of possibility for history to actually be able to evaluate this evidence and say, okay, we have these questions. How then do we explain something like an empty tomb, or even Jesus's disciples go back and the account of the Pentecost happens in Jerusalem. So Jesus's disciples go back to the scene of the crime in the town where people would have saw him crucified, and now they're proclaiming he's resurrected. Well, why would you go back to the place where people could have actually known what actually happened, especially if you're trying to be disingenuous or dishonest? And then that's where it happens. And you know, Stephen is the first martyr. That also happens in Jerusalem. That would have been a warning shot across the bow for the disciples if they wanted to continue on proclaiming these things. They would have realized that this is controversial, both in Jewish circles and in Gentile circles, to be proclaiming these things, to be declaring Jesus as Lord. You know, one of the earliest confessions of Christianity was Jesus is Lord, when the society was saying Caesar is Lord. And so there were risks politically, there were risks religiously, and yet the disciples go on to proclaim these things, even to the detriment of their own lives.
Plus, historians agree that Christianity exploded in Jerusalem itself, the very place where the resurrection could have been easily disproven if the body were still in the tomb. In other words, the best historical evidence we have points to something massive happening that transformed terrified fishermen into bold, world-changing witnesses. Joe Rogan wonders how much was lost through oral tradition, and Wes explains something pretty fascinating about ancient cultures.
You got to wonder, like, how much did we lose in this oral tradition? Like, what was the original story, and what were they trying to convey?
I mean, we are modern people of the Enlightenment. So we almost have a perspective where we want something to be very exhaustive, that ancient writers didn't have those same sort of conventions. Or so they're going to capitalize on certain ideas, because you can read all sorts of things because of your modern conventions into what someone is talking about in the ancient world and completely bypass what they're actually trying to convey in their intention.
Yeah, and again, it's almost impossible to put your mind completely into the context of these people that were living then.
Ancient oral cultures were way better at memorization than we are today. They could preserve massive amounts of information with remarkable accuracy because storytelling was their main way of preserving history. So while it's true that we have to be careful reading modern assumptions into ancient texts, it's wrong to think they were just casually making things up. They were incredibly disciplined about passing things down. The Sinai Bible actually also came up in Julian's conversation with Wes, and Wes made an interesting reference to Billy Carson during this discussion.
Interestingly enough, when Billy Carson refers to the Sinai Bible, he's talking about this.
When he said, is that the whole thing where he talks about like Jesus going to the pyramids and shit?
No, he says that the crucifixion is not in the Sinai Bible. And he credits this as one of, if not the earliest Bibles.
And you're saying this is the same thing?
I'm saying this is not just the same thing, but this reads exactly like your copy of the Gospel of Matthew today.
And it says the opposite of what he's saying.
It says what any other Bible translation you're going to work with. So
and you can find that through this Codex Sinaiticus.
Yeah, you could just go to chapter and verse and read through it.
Billy Carson says something ridiculous about the book of Jesus' wife, but Wes again completely debunks everything Billy says, and then Billy once again tries to change the subject.
You know, and then also one of the things that were interesting is that they discovered the book of Jesus' wife, which is at the Harvard Seminary, which according to some scholars, is a little controversial, but they claim that this is an accurate record that Jesus may have even been married, which then, you know, adds more, if that's true, it adds more to the hypothesis that maybe he wasn't crucified. Let's talk about the Old Testament a little bit and leading up into the New Testament.
Hold on, because do you mind if I address the Gospel of Jesus' wife?
Sure, go ahead.
What was her name?
Yeah,
I'm like trying to write notes like I know what I'm doing, but I'm just curious.
So the Gospel of Jesus' wife doesn't actually mention. So oftentimes what happens is that The text of the Gospel of Jesus' wife is kind of paralleled with the Gospel of Philip, which mentions that that Jesus would kiss Mary Magdalene on the mouth. And so those are kind of used in parallel to kind of for this argument that Jesus was married. So the Gospel of Jesus' wife is in the Harvard Library. However, the reason we know it's also not legitimate is because even though the manuscript, the papyrus that it's on, was carbon dated to the 4th century, the text was actually copied from a PDF version of the Gospel of Thomas known as Grandin's Interlinear. And there was a mistake in the Coptic text of Grandin's Interlinear that was copied into the Gospel of Jesus' wife. So we know that this is not a legitimate document, even though the papyrus is ancient, and this happens a lot with forgeries. I have a couple of friends who have actually worked on projects that have revealed forgeries within Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts and within other ancient Christian papyri. But the reason why we know the Gospel of Jesus' wife, and that Karen King, who kind of vouched for it and she lost a lot of credibility, unfortunately, for her, and she's admitted that it's a fake as well, was because we can tie it directly to not copying from an ancient text, but actually copying from an online version of the Gospel of Thomas in a PDF form. And the mistake on that PDF form was copied into the text that was borrowed in the phraseology of Jesus' wife. So I just point that out is, once again, with our sourcing, I think we need to make sure that we're going towards not just early sources, but actually credible sources. And unfortunately, neither the Gospel of Barnabas nor the Gospel of Jesus' wife are credible sources in terms of actually, and agreed upon by not just the vast majority of scholarship, but I don't know anybody in the field of papyrology, paleography, historiography, who actually refers to these documents as being legitimate.
That's fair enough. I can respect that. So let's go into the Old Testament a little bit.
The Gospel of Jesus' wife was exposed as a fake when scholars discovered its Coptic text copied a modern online edition of the Gospel of Thomas, including a unique grammatical error from the digital version. Even though the papyrus was ancient, the text itself came from a 21st century PDF. Karen King, who initially promoted it, later acknowledged it was a forgery. Here's Joe Rogan asking Wes about the eyewitness evidence for the resurrection.
Yeah, so
no, not like that.
Then 400 people saw him afterwards. And how many different people have some sort of a recollection or a writing or something that's attributed to them of being witness to his resurrection?
Well, you have Peter, Paul, Jude, James, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The thing with Matthew, Mark, and Luke is that Matthew and John are attributed to direct disciples of Jesus. Luke and Mark are not. So they are not eyewitnesses within the Jesus community.
What makes these eyewitness accounts compelling is that they come from people who have nothing to gain and everything to lose by proclaiming a risen Jesus. Many of them were beaten, imprisoned, or killed for their testimony, yet they never recanted. That kind of consistent, sacrificial witness adds serious weight to their credibility. Patrick Bet David notices that Christianity is declining in the world and asks Wes why this is happening. And Wes brings up a really good point about this.
I have a theory. I'm trying to see from you that this is your world. What theories do you have?
Yeah.
Because you're doing your part. It's not like you're not doing it. This isn't criticism towards you.
Yeah.
You understand what I'm saying? You're doing your part. You're going out there. You're sharing your testimony. You're doing it in a graceful way. You're setting the right example. You're growing your family. You have 3 kids. You're trying to, set the example. But again, responsibility of everybody else. One side, 1.9 billion, growing faster than us. The other side, flatline with churches declining.
Yeah. I think there have been a number of things that have happened in the West. In the last few decades, I think we want to hold on to the fruit of our Judeo-Christian values, but we want to ignore the roots that actually grew that fruit.
You really can't keep the benefits of Christianity, like human rights, dignity, and freedom, if you rip out the belief system that created them. Secular culture wants the morals without the maker, but that's not sustainable long term. Eventually, when you sever the roots, the entire tree withers, and we're starting to see that happen now. Julian asks Wes a really debated question about how the Bible was formed. and Wes answers it masterfully, with solid evidence to back up his position.
What can you just walk me through the timeline of when they were written and who wrote them and how they came upon the stories within there?
Yeah, so this is a really debated topic within New Testament studies. I would take a very early dating of the vast majority of the New Testament with some caveats. Now, I would put the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, pre-70. I would put them pretty close to the earliest one. For argument's sake, I would say that Mark is the earliest, which is kind of the general scholarship recognition. Mark writes first. He's probably writing anywhere between 10 to 30 years after Jesus. And then Luke and John are writing afterwards. And then I would actually put, sorry, I said that wrong. Mark writes first, then Matthew
10
and
to
Luke.
30 years for Mark after Jesus.
Anywhere between 50 and 70. Now, we know from external sources that are outside the Bible that both Peter and Paul are martyred in Rome around 64 to 66 AD. And so Luke actually records these deaths, but conspicuously doesn't record the deaths of Peter and Paul. And the argument is that if he knew about them, it would have been the perfect ending to the book.
Yeah.
Because it would have put the capstone on the whole argument that he's trying to make. So whatever's going on, Luke needs to be written before their death. It needs to have concluded before the death of Peter and Paul to make sense. And Luke is definitely using Mark. And Matthew...
This argument is part of what's called the argument from silence, and it's compelling when applied to Luke's omission of Peter and Paul's martyrdom, especially since Luke loves big dramatic endings. If Acts ends before AD 66, and Luke was written earlier, that puts Luke's gospel possibly in the late 50s or early 60s, which in turn pushes Mark and Matthew even earlier. That means most of the New Testament was circulating well within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, undermining the claim that it was all mythologized generations later. Piers asks when the Gospels were actually written, and Wes shares just how early he thinks the Gospels were written.
What do we know, do you think, historically, about when the Gospels were actually written? Because the sort of counter-argument to their veracity is that the earliest Gospel, Mark, was written in 70 AD, which would be 40 years after Jesus died, and likely well after the death of the eyewitnesses, given the life expectancy at the time. Similarly, scholarly consensus says that John was written in 90 to 100 AD, although I think you believe it was written a lot earlier. So from everything you've gleaned about this, what is the most likely time when these Gospels were written, do you think? And why do you think, Wesley, it could be a lot earlier than the assumed scholarly consensus?
Yeah, well, I think if we go by the assumption that Mark is written first, which I think is approximately reasonable to assume based on a number of different factors, and then then Matthew and Luke come afterwards. Well, Luke's prologue certainly indicates that he's, as I said before, he's writing up an orderly account on the basis that previous accounts are either not as well researched or simply sloppy in their writing. And I think if you look at Mark's syntax and grammar and the flow, certainly qualifies a bit of an unorderly account. So I think that Luke probably has Mark in mind when he makes that comment. And I do think that the evidence bears out a literary relationship between Matthew and Luke based on their parallel usage in sections that certainly extract wording that is very, very similar, if not identical, and most likely indicates Luke coming after Matthew. However, Luke was a traveling companion of Paul, and Luke writes the Gospel of Luke and then Acts. They're kind of a part one, part two. What we know based on external biblical evidence, so sources outside of the Bible itself, that Paul dies in 64 AD, and then Peter between 64 and 68 AD. And I think actually that that Luke's book of Acts is making an argument with a relationship between the connection of the apostolic brothers of Peter and Paul. According to Richard Baucham, who's a historian in the UK, he actually ascribes that Acts is written at least before 64 AD. And Acts follows Luke's gospel, and Matthew predates Luke, and Luke precedes Mark. And so therefore, it isn't ridiculous to put Matthew, I think, because Luke doesn't include Peter and Paul's death. And we know that both Peter and Paul die somewhere between 64 and 68 in the same city in Rome and are martyred. And yet the book of the book of Acts doesn't include their death, even though the argument kind of flow throughout it is to connect these individuals. So I think we can say at minimum, Acts is written before the death of Peter and Paul. So therefore, I think at the very least, given the lack of Peter and Paul's death, it's a good marker to put the synoptics pre-70. That's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I'm certainly not alone on that early dating either. You know, Richard Baucham, who I mentioned, Dan Wallace, Peter J. Williams, John Dixon, F.F. Bruce, Jonathan Bernier, Michael Kruger. There are lots of scholars who do that. But I would put Mark anywhere within the realm of 40 or 50, and then the other Gospels not coming long after that, but certainly all of Matthew, Mark, and Luke before 70 AD, and getting right into kind of the first couple of decades within the early eyewitness testimony of Jesus's life.
Wes's view is not fringe. Scholars like Richard Baucham, Daniel Wallace, Peter J. Williams, and Michael Kruger have all argued for early gospel dates, based on internal and historical evidence. Even some moderate scholars accept that Acts was likely written before Paul's death, placing Luke and its sources even earlier. This challenges the common claim that the Gospels were written too late to reflect first-hand testimony. Joe Rogan asks Wes how Christians make sense of ancient hominids like Neanderthals, and Wes once again gives a great answer.
So as a Christian, what do you think about all this stuff? Like, what do you think about ancient hominids, Australopithecus, Neanderthals? Like, what was God up to with all this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a scientist, so I got to stay in my lane. I ultimately would be an advocate for intelligent design, where I would say that that God purposefully created humanity. The intricacies of Neo-Darwinian evolution is not quite explaining some of what's going on with things like the fossil record and some of the gaps that we have in there.
Fossil evidence shows that Neanderthals and other ancient humans shared key human traits, such as tool use, burial of their dead, and symbolic behavior, suggesting they were fully human rather than separate primitive species. Genetic studies confirm that Neanderthals and modern humans interbred, supporting the idea that they were variations within the same created humankind. Here's Patrick asking Wes about the consequences of leaving the Christian faith compared to the consequences of leaving Islam.
What happens if I choose to leave the Christian church? What if I say I'm done? I don't want to be a Christian anymore. What does the church do to me?
Well, if they're a good church, I think they should follow up with you. They should pursue you.
But will anything happen to me? Am I in trouble?
Oh, no, you're not in danger.
I'm not in danger.
No.
Is somebody sending me a write-up? As the senior pastor going to write me up, and I'm going to have to go see HR department at the church?
No.
Now, what happens if I leave the religion of Islam?
Well, the penalty could be death.
And that's a massive difference that almost never gets talked about. Christianity invites you to faith through love and persuasion. Islam, in many places, enforces it through fear and control. The way a religion treats people who leave says everything about whether it's based on freedom or force. This isn't just theoretical. Apostasy laws still exist today in countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, where leaving Islam can lead to prison or execution. By contrast, Christianity's earliest spread came through martyrs dying for their faith, not killing others to preserve it. That contrast reveals the heart of each message: coercion versus conviction. Julian has a lot of misconceptions about the Council of Nicaea, as most people do because of Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, and Julian asks Wes some questions about it. And Wes, being a historian who has studied topics like these extensively, explains what the Council of Nicaea was really about.
You have this Council of Nicaea in the 4th century. It was like
325.
Yeah, 325. So this is where my brain wires get like blocked a little bit, because you have a power structure, the Roman government led by the emperor, who now sees this new growing idea where there's many Christians within his empire, and he's going, oh, we're having trouble putting putting the button on this. Like, they really believe in this guy, Jesus Christ, and what happened. And by the way, we kind of put him to death. That's not a good look. So they have this big meeting with a lot of different people, and they dictate, guess what? We are now the Holy Roman Empire. We believe in Christianity, and here's everything that happened. And the question is, you have power-hungry men in this meeting,
Sure.
who are now dictating, taking legitimate pieces of history, but deciding what we're going to tell the public about or what we're going to make the book. And the reason I bring this up is because within this meeting and subsequent, practicing of the religion throughout the empire afterwards, there was a decision made where these are the 4 gospels we use, not these other gospels that we found as well. And one of the alleged gospels there, but all of them are interesting, is that, like Mary Magdalene had a gospel, and she's not written about in great terms, or at least in implied great terms, in the 4 gospels they chose, as opposed to in her gospel and in other gospels written, it's like, yo, she wasn't like a, she was Jesus's companion, perhaps his wife, and then it gets into like, oh, does Jesus have a kid or something like that? That's kind of a step farther. But like, what do you make of the fact that the religion, which you are not a part of the Catholic Church, right? You're a part of Protestant, but all
Part of my heritage.
Exactly. Yeah. All Christianity branched off from that. That's where we'll get to Martin Luther later. I wanted to put a pin in that. But like, what do you think of the fact that like there are political power structures that took this history and decided what people are going to see, and then basically said, this is why we believe that way? Because they also at this meeting allegedly decided we're going to make Jesus divine, even though I agree with you. I think that there's historical evidence before that points to people saying, oh yeah, no, he is divine. He did rise from the dead.
So some corrective history there. Let me just say right off the bat, the Council of Nicaea, the reason it was called was to deal with an issue called Arianism. So there was a guy named Arius who was a minister in North Africa, and he believed that Jesus was God, but he believed that Jesus was created by the Father and the Godhead.
This made Jesus a lesser created being, something the early church firmly rejected as heresy. So the Council of Nicaea didn't invent Jesus' divinity. It defended what Christians had already been preaching for centuries.
So this is the topic of the Council of Nicaea. The topic of the Council of Nicaea actually had nothing to do with the books of the Bible. So the books of the Bible had already been established centuries before.
Not for the Roman Empire, though.
What do you mean?
Meaning this is where the Roman Empire officially kind of makes their shift to like, yay, we're Christians now, right? Like that's...
So it isn't.
It isn't.
No. So Constantine converts to Christianity, but he doesn't make Christianity the imperial religion of Rome. That's
right, not lawfully. Right.
Yeah, so that's under Theodosius, which is after him. The Council of Nicaea doesn't even talk about the books of Scripture. So nothing at the Council of Nicaea has anything to do with the canon of Scripture. That's already an established fact.
I know. That's what I'm saying. So how would the Roman Empire have gotten along with the acceptance of what the Gospels are?
Oh, they don't. No, this is established by Christianity.
Yes,
so Christians,
I know that.
So Christians already have the 27 books that we call the New Testament.
And who would you say established that? Like, it may not be one person, but like what people said, yo, this is what we're going with.
So there are lots of canon lists within the early church.
The Muratorian fragment, circa 8170, includes most of the New Testament, and early church fathers like Irenaeus, Origen, and Eusebius affirmed the 4 Gospels and key epistles. These books were accepted because they were written by apostles or their close companions, taught Orthodox doctrine, and were widely used across the early Christian world.
So even though we kind of have this idea that somebody somewhere got together and voted on books or tried to reach some consensus about books. And realistically, that never actually took place in history. It was a lot slower and a lot more organic than that. And there were disagreements on some books and not others. So very, very early on, you have the Gospels. Nobody disagrees on the Gospels. And
nobody disagrees on that.
No, everybody agrees that these are the 4 books.
What? Everybody?
Well, all the Christians. So here's the thing. The disciples of Jesus had disciples. And those are individuals who we call the apostolic fathers.
Yeah.
Because they have a direct association with...
It's like a bloodline almost.
Yeah. It's the it's like the paper trail that goes back to the chain of custody that goes back to Jesus.
Good way to put it.
And part of this is that we have individuals who know Mark, and we have individuals who know Mark who say, hey, this Mark guy is not a disciple, but he's a traveling companion of Peter. And he follows Peter around and he writes what Peter says. And so we have a number of individuals like this, Irenaeus, Polycarp, Papias. And so they give us this unanimous confirmation within this early community, because it's not a very big community at this point, in saying, okay, well, we know who the authors of the Gospels are, and we have this direct chain of custody paper trail that goes back to the earliest Jesus community.
This early chain of custody is key. It means the Gospels weren't anonymous legends, but traceable accounts tied to eyewitnesses or their close companions. That's why books like the Gospel of Thomas or Mary never made it in. They had no credible connection to the apostolic circle.
So, for example, the last line of the Gospel of Thomas has Peter looking at Jesus and saying, hey, Mary's here. Get Mary out because women are not worthy of life. And so Jesus says, don't worry, I'm going to make her into a male that resembles you, male. And the last line of the Gospel of Thomas is, every woman who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven.
Like transgenderism?
So it's complicated, right? They were before their time, right? So the early church looked at this kind of content and they went, what is this?
Yeah.
Like, that's not, we know what the teaching of Jesus sounds like. It ain't that. And one thing that's very unique about some of these documents is there's a criteria within historiography that's referred to as the criterion of embarrassment. And so the idea is, if there is something within the writing that reflects very poorly on either the authors or the people connected with the authors, it is a good assumption to say that it is probably true. Not that it's always true, but that it's probably true, because you're not going to put your, right, this is what I was, we were talking earlier about some of the perspectives of prophethood in Islam versus Christianity. My Muslim friends have a problem with the prophets looking as bad as they do in the Old Testament, because they're like, a representation of a man of God wouldn't look like that.
And you and I were talking off camera about this earlier. Muslims view prophets as like a form of divine, like a form of relative perfection.
Or at least there's an understanding within, say, Sunni orthodoxy that I don't think it's not all Muslims, but sort of historical Sunni orthodoxy within Islam would largely have an understanding of prophets being close to sinless, if not sinless. And so if you have someone like King David, who in the Bible, he's a murderer, he's an adulterer, he sleeps with Bathsheba, and then Bathsheba's husband comes back from war.
Is this the same David with Goliath?
Yeah.
Well, he did kill Goliath.
He killed Goliath, but that was a good move, right? Yeah. So he kills Goliath. He goes on. He's a great king, but he always has this problem of he just loves the ladies too much, right?
Nothing wrong with that.
So the story is he's standing on the roof. He sees Bathsheba. She's on her roof and she's bathing, and he's like, "Oh, I like that." And so he calls her and he sleeps with her. But her husband is fighting on the front lines for him. And her husband comes home and he's like, "Oh, this is a problem." So he tries to put her husband even more on the front lines so that he dies.
Please die.
And then he dies, right? And so he's like purposefully like micromanaging the death of this woman's husband so that he can basically, because she becomes pregnant, and that's problematic because her husband's he brings him back from war and wants her husband to sleep with her so that he might think that he got her pregnant. And he's such a devotee of David that he won't go home. He sleeps in front of the palace gate because he's like, my comrades in arms, they're out on the battlefields, they're in the trenches.
His wife's getting knocked up by the king.
Yeah,
oh my God.
Yeah. So all that to say, from a historian perspective, we look at this and we're like, hey, this is like the good guy. David's the good guy. He's
Allegedly.
the king, right? But he is a bit of a scumbag. Like, he does these things. So we can look at that and we can say, especially within the ancient Near East, you never make the king look bad. So in this regard, that's probably true. These events probably took place because you look at all of the other ancient Near Eastern, the Mesopotamian, the Egyptian kings, the pharaohs, and they're always going above and beyond to try to make them look good.
Other examples include the disciples falling asleep while Jesus prays in Gethsemane, women being the first witnesses to the resurrection, and Peter's many public failures, including denying Jesus 3 times. These details are unlikely inventions and reflect the raw honesty of the early Christian writings.
the Gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas, Peter, Judas, portray Jesus not as a Jew, but as a pagan mystic.
A pagan mystic.
Yes.
Like pagan towards what Roman paganism believed at the time, or just like
to a
randomly
certain degree,
pagan?
in the sense of, so you and I, previous to recording, were talking about what's sometimes referred to as substance dualism in the ancient world, where they believe that the physical world is bad and the spiritual world is good. So there were groups, like there was a group called the Docetics, or the Docetics. Dokein in Greek means to seem. So whereas some people today might have a problem with Jesus being God, in the ancient world, they didn't necessarily have that problem. They had a problem with him being man, like that he was a human was a problem. Because if Jesus is God, they're like, he can't be physical. Physical is bad. So they would strip that of him. And so this is particularly true in the Gospel of Peter, because the Gospel of Peter has a floating Jesus. He's a doketic Jesus. He's not actually there. And so in the instance of the crucifixion, Jesus is pretty chill because he's not even really being crucified. And so that is a pagan idea that comes from Platonic philosophy that is written onto Jesus.
This kind of thinking led to Gnostic Gospels that downplayed or denied Jesus' humanity, reflecting more of Greek dualism than Jewish theology. Early Christians fiercely rejected these ideas, insisting that Jesus was fully God and fully man, because only a real bodily resurrection could defeat real bodily death. Joe Rogan questions whether Jesus might have survived the crucifixion, and Wes responds by pointing to the overwhelming historical evidence.
Do you think it's possible that he didn't die? And do you think it's possible that they thought he was dead? Because that does happen. There was actually a case very recently where a guy was about to be harvested for organs. They thought he was dead, and this guy started moving again and came back to life.
If you look at, say, very skeptical biblical scholars, they will say if we can know anything about Jesus, they'll say one thing we can be sure of is that he died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Because we have not just multiple attested documents that we refer to as the New Testament, but Roman and Greek and Jewish writers refer to that claim afterwards and talk about the fact that you have this guy, and it's mocked within earliest Christianity.
Even critics like Bar Ehrman say Jesus' death by crucifixion is one of the most certain facts of ancient history. Roman executioners were experts. If they failed to kill a prisoner, it could cost them their own lives. And beyond the New Testament, sources like Tacitus and Josephus also confirm Jesus' death. During Wes's discussion with Patrick Bet David, Wes points out how Billy Carson gets away with saying such blatant lies so often.
With something like using the Gospel of the Holy 12, or the accusation that Billy uses for the Sinai Bible, Codex Sinaiticus, denying the crucifixion, I think I can come up with a theory as to how he developed that, which is based on a misunderstanding of a textual variant at the end of the Gospel of Mark that is in Codex Vaticanus. Or sorry, not Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus. But to then repeat this constantly and say that the crucifixion isn't in the Codex Sinaiticus entirely, I'm not sure why he would go about that or where kind of the reasoning came from. As far as I can tell, a lot of these are original to Billy, and they sound sensationalistic, and a lot of people don't have the repertoire or the background to know what something like Codex Sinaiticus is. And so when he's throwing that out to you, or he's throwing that out to Andrew Schulz, or he's throwing that out to Joe Rogan, it's not in your like categories of information that you just kind of have off the top of your head. So you just kind of take it at face value.
Billy Carson thrives on exploiting gaps in public knowledge. He names obscure-sounding texts to sound authoritative, knowing most people won't fact-check him. By confidently repeating false claims in high-profile interviews, he gains credibility through repetition, not accuracy. It's less about scholarship and more about showmanship, and it works on audiences who don't know what to look for. Joe asks whether there were any early counter-narratives to the resurrection, and Wes explains why even those didn't deny the empty tomb.
So we have an account of the resurrection. Do we have an account of the denial of the resurrection? Is there an historical record of him just dying and this, like a refutal or a rebuttal rather to what they're saying?
No, the only ones from the ancient world that deny his resurrection are groups that come on afterwards that sometimes are described as Gnostics, and they're not necessarily just denying it for the reasons we might think they were. They're denying it because they have incorporated ideas of pagan philosophy where they believe that the spiritual is good and the physical is bad.
It's important that the earliest critics didn't argue the body was still there. They just tried to explain it away, like claiming the disciples stole it. That tells us everyone agreed the tomb was empty. The real debate was never about whether the body was gone, but how it happened. Here's Joe Rogan commenting on how quickly Christianity grew in numbers and influence, and Wes explaining just why that happened.
Kind of crazy that it wound up taking over the area.
Well, that's part of, I think, the argument of, well, how do you explain that? How do you explain it going from 11 scared disciples in an upper room to being willing to go out and die for the proclamation that you believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and you saw him and you touched him and you ate with him, and he wasn't a ghost. You actually ate fish with the resurrected Jesus.
Within just 300 years, Christianity went from a fringe persecuted sect in Judea to the dominant faith in the Roman Empire. Despite having no political power, military force, or wealth, it spread rapidly through personal witness, sacrificial love, and the unwavering conviction of the early believers. By the 4th century, it had outlasted emperors and transformed the most powerful civilization on Earth. Piers brings up Ricky Gervais's popular 3,000 Gods argument, and Wes explains why that argument is actually pretty stupid.
I've seen Ricky Gervais on various talk shows. He's one of the world's most famous atheists. And he says, look, there are 3,000 gods if you add them all up from all the religions. Who's to say your one's the real one? And what about the others then? Do they not exist? Are they not real gods? In other words, his position is, look, you can't all be right unless there are 3,000 different versions of a supernatural, spiritual being overseeing us all. What do you say to him?
Yeah, well, I think it's a rather foolish argument in that competition doesn't negate objective reality. So say we're using a courtroom analogy. If someone was convicted of a crime here in the city of Toronto where I live, and he stood before a judge and he said, really, you think I committed this crime? Do you know how many people are in the city? We have 3 million people in this city. And you think I'm the one who did the crime? Really? Out of all the, how many people are in Toronto? How many people are in Ontario? How many people are in Canada? How many people are in North America? You really think that given the amount of people that are on this earth, I'm the one who committed the crime? We wouldn't then look at the judge and say, well, that's a good argument. Have you really thought about how many other people are around who, just because this particular individual you think committed the crime? Really? Well, no, we don't just arbitrarily, pick someone, or in the case of Christianity, pick a God. We believe that the God of the Bible is the true God based on the evidence of not just what we find in the Bible, but, the fine-tuning of the universe, of the morality in the objective reality of this world, and the fact that we are, Piers, people who operate with morals, with meaning and intention, and have intrinsic worth. But we look at these things and we don't arbitrarily pick Yahweh, the God of the Bible, over Zeus and Thor and Allah and Buddha. We do it, I would argue, based on the concrete, publicly available evidence that points to the truth claims that I would argue Christianity answers in regards to the ultimate questions we have.
I like some things about Ricky Gervais, but what he said here about the 3,000 gods thing is just so ridiculous. The point isn't how many gods there are, but whether it's rational to believe in any particular god. As Christians, we believe we can demonstrate the irrationality of the other supposed gods out there. Joe Rogan has a lot of questions about how people decided which books would be in the Bible, and Wes's answer again demonstrates his expertise on the subject.
Are there any books that were decided, and how do they pick the order that these these stories are in the Bible? And are there any books that were excluded?
Yes.
Where there's debate on it?
Yeah, great question. So this is the issue of what's sometimes called the canon of Scripture.
Right.
So very early on, when you have Christians having these conversations, the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there's unanimous agreement about those. Now, Ignatius of Antioch specifically highlights the fact that the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Truth, Gospel of the Hebrews, Gospel of, these ones that we kind of hear about, Mary, Judas, that the reason we know that they're not associated with the names that are attached to them is because they're being written in times when those people were dead, and they have these rings of pagan philosophy that are incorporated into them.
The so-called lost gospels weren't hidden. Early Christians knew about them and rejected them because they were clearly written too late and didn't line up with Jesus' actual teachings. Books like the Gospel of Thomas reflect Gnostic ideas, not first-century Christianity. The 4 biblical gospels were accepted because they came from eyewitnesses or their close associates. Billy Carson makes an absurd claim about the Bible, and Wes can hardly contain his disbelief at what he is hearing.
A lot of in Genesis, a lot of the creation story that comes into Genesis, not all of it, but because obviously Genesis is a much smaller version of a much bigger story. But it's literally almost word for word from the Enuma Elish and the 7 tablets of creation.
The Enuma Elish. So what are the parallels there?
Separated the waters from the waters, for example. That's in the Enuma Elish, and that's also in the biblical text.
Okay, that I would agree is a parallel. The only reason I highlight that is that if you're making this the argument, because if you brought it up, and I mean this with all due respect, there are superficial parallels. I would agree. The separation of the water. The concept of the earth being formless and void, that's also in the Enuma Elish. However, I think all the other details, it's the details that make the difference. And if we're looking at not the superficial crossovers, but the actual themes and concepts of what it's saying, you don't have a creation within 7 days.
Unlike the Enuma Elish, which describes a violent creation through divine warfare and the dismemberment of a goddess, Genesis presents a peaceful, orderly creation by a sovereign God speaking. The tone, theology, and purpose of Genesis are radically different. It's not just a Hebrew copy-paste of Babylonian myth, but a polemic against it. In fact, many scholars believe Genesis was written to deliberately contrast pagan cosmologies and assert a God who brings order, not chaos. Joe Rogan asks Wes a very reasonable question about whether there might be any legitimacy to any of the books that were excluded from the Bible. And again, Wes has the answer.
And so these books that were not included, are any of them interesting? I mean,
they're all interesting.
But does any of it seem like it belongs in the New Testament?
Well, so part of the problem with some of these other books is they appear to be almost completely reliant on the other books. So you do have, and some of them have an agenda to them. The author of the Gospel of Peter has no understanding of purity ritual rites within first century Second Temple Judaism, but is also clearly trying to remedy this embarrassing fact.
Wow.
A lot of the lost Gospels actually borrow heavily from the real ones. They're not giving new eyewitness information. Some even make historical mistakes that someone from Jesus' time would not have made. That's why early Christians recognize them as later inventions, not trustworthy accounts. Julian is pretty convinced that Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code brings up some pretty good points against the Bible, but Wes patiently explains that Julian is basically completely wrong about the Da Vinci Code.
And to be clear, like the Da Vinci Code also fictionalizes a lot of things because it's a story
Yeah.
for sure. Like there's certainly great aspects of history within that Dan Brown puts within that, but there's also things that are, for the story. That said, there is some kind of compromise though, right? Isn't there certainly a possibility that maybe some simple compromises are therefore then made at that meeting, such as maybe what dates they choose to put certain holidays on that may have matched previous things that the Romans did under their pagan religion and stuff like that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's not a question of possibility. Almost everything is possible. It's a question of probability. And so at this point, you already have the fact that Christianity was decriminalized over a decade before.
Right. 312.
So you already have 10 plus years of kind of Constantine showing his cards. He converts in that time. And I actually think, based on how it is described, that his conversion was legitimate. I think he actually believed, because part of that is that it was at great detriment to his actual political power.
It was.
Yeah. So we actually have the actual documentation. It's not hard to figure out what Nicaea was actually about. We have the receipts from what actually took place. So that's why when you have something like Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, and he's saying that all sorts of things took place, every scholar on planet Earth who had ever even done a cursory glance at Nicaea was like, hold on, like this is pretty easily demonstrated to be not just not the case, but like way off on a different universe.
Yeah.
Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code falsely claimed that Jesus' divinity was invented at Nicaea, and that the biblical canon was decided there. But literally none of that is true. The council didn't even discuss which books belonged in the Bible, and early Christian writings from well before Nicaea clearly affirmed Jesus as divine. Brown's narrative isn't just inaccurate, it's wildly misleading and completely out of sync with real historical scholarship. This is my absolute favorite question asked to Wes, and I love Joe Rogan's response after Wes answers it.
So, what is your personal belief when it comes to the resurrection? What do you think happened? Do you have a belief, or do you just try to interpret the text and try to see what is the message?
Well, I think so. As a historian, I do think it is a historical question. You have a guy who objectively lived, he objectively died, and then individuals close to his inner circle claim that they see him not dead.
Right.
Again.
This is a highly unusual activity.
Highly unusual.
Right.
Yeah, it's definitely highly unusual activity. And the amazing part is that it actually happened.
I choose to believe the Bible because it's a reliable collection of historical documents written down by eyewitnesses during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses. They report to us supernatural events that took place in fulfillment of specific prophecies and claim that their writings are divine rather than human in origin.
Hey, I'm Mike. If you want to support what I'm doing and help these videos reach more people, would you consider clicking that subscribe button? Thank you so much for watching this video until the end. Here is another one that you might find interesting.